friends, today I'm going to be talking about my experience reading Brandon Sanderson for the very first time. Let's jump in. I had not really known or heard all that much about Brandon Sanderson until about a year ago. Well, let's go back actually. I had heard about Brandon Sanderson because people in my circle are big fans of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. As some of you might know, Brandon Sanderson finished that series as Robert Jordan unfortunately passed away before the series completion. Most of the things that I had heard about Brandon Sanderson were not overly favorable from my friend group because they felt that the writing was too dissimilar to Robert Jordan's and they didn't like a lot of the tonal shifts and character shifts within the narrative that had ended up ending the series, which was rather unfortunate. Last year, when the Wheel of Time series, we can have a whole other conversation on that, premiered on Amazon, I decided to do a little comparison between the show and the books. This introduced me to BookTube and led me to my friend BookBorn's channel. She did a comparison of what was in the book and what was in the show, and it turned out that Sanderson was actually a producer on the show. I then started deep diving into this atmosphere called BookTube. I had never really heard anything about it, and then came upon all of these booktubers who specialized in fantasy reading, sci-fi reading, a little bit of both. Some read fiction, some read nonfiction. It's a really cool atmosphere and aspect of YouTube that I really knew nothing about. It seemed like most people that read fantasy felt that Brandon Sanderson was the best writer, at least that was presently writing. So I asked my husband for Christmas. I said, you know what? I'm going to give it a go. I would like to read Mistborn. I feel like Mistborn is a good place to start with Sanderson. I'll base my opinion of him on that and go from there and see if I like him as an author and we can assess. I can honestly say after reading the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, The Final Empire, it's worth it. He is such a good author. I'm sorry that everyone feels a bit slighted by the end of Wheel of Time, but let's talk about how good the first book is of Mistborn. Now, this is the first book. I have the traditional paperback copies, which is a little unfortunate in that I've already ruined the spines of all of the books, but not the end of the world. Part of this review is going to be spoilery and not spoilery. I'm going to start off with my non-spoilery aspect of the book. We have a different world and it has a magic system. Sanderson is apparently renowned for creating really intense and intricate magic systems and great world building. I can attest to that in the first book. I feel like that is accurate. There is a decent level of world building. I did like the magic system. It was rooted in an aspect of science, which I thought was really fascinating. And it didn't feel like it was really lacking in any way, which I really enjoyed. One of the main things that I will say could be a little bit of an issue for fantasy readers with this series is that it is marketed as both YA and adult fantasy. If you're not really into YA, it might not be the type of book series that you're really going to gravitate towards, but there are aspects to the narrative that are definitely beyond YA, and we'll get a little bit more into that in our spoilery review. The two protagonists of this book, I would characterize them as Vin, who is a 16-year-old girl, and Kelsier, who is a Mistborn, which is not giving away anything. It's pretty apparent from the beginning of the book. We jump into a world where there are very significant class discrepancies. It is called the Final Empire. The Final Empire is ruled by the Lord Ruler. He has been in charge for the last 1,000 years and has had a very tyrannical and oppressive regime, especially towards this one group of people called Ska. They are what I would classify as the serfs of this world. They are traditionally worked on plantations, some in the city. The main city where the Lord Ruler lives is called Luthadel. They have just been continually oppressed for this last 1,000 years. The story reads as an Ocean's 11 type narrative mixed in with aspects of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. If that's your jam, then you're really going to be all about this book and the series as a whole. I'm now going to jump into a little bit more of the spoilery aspects, so I'm going to give you a couple of seconds. If you are not looking to get spoiled, you are more than welcome to turn the video off now. If you are looking to have a little bit more of in-depth analysis, we are going to start in 3, 2, 1. Some of the spoilers of this book. We are introduced to Kelsier in the very beginning of the narrative. He is apparently a survivor, and there is already a myth surrounding of this survivor from the pits of Hathsin. He is something called a Mistborn, which is someone who can utilize all of the metals and allow them to access different abilities and different powers. He then encounters Vin, and Vin is going to be a really polarizing character for a lot of people. She is 16, like I mentioned, but she is an abuse survivor. She has been living on the streets her entire life. She's basically classified as a street urchin from the very beginning. She struggles with the fact that she has been consistently abandoned her whole life. Her mother tried to kill her after hearing voices. It's implied that she's essentially schizophrenic, and her brother abused her and beat her and threatened to leave her in brothels as a prostitute. She ends up working for a thieving crew and utilizes what she calls luck to help manipulate people to bend them to her will. She ends up learning on not long afterwards that she is also in fact a Mistborn and gets pulled into this crew and works for Kelsier. We then learn as the reader that Kelsier's grand plan is to overthrow the final empire and to kill the Lord Ruler for having sent him to the pits of Hathsin. And the group that is accumulated by Kelsier, they are a really fun crew. You definitely get that Ocean's 11 vibe with this. You can also get some of the fellowship aspects of it, where each character has their own defined personality and really interesting characteristics. All of them are able to practice magic in some way, shape, or form based on a metal. Kelsier is a Mistborn, so like I said, he can tap into all of these things. There's some that are called soothers. There's some that can use tin to enhance their senses, others that burn iron to enhance their strength. And the way that Sanderson writes them is incredibly compelling, and it's actually really fun in the language, and some of the characters themselves are just straight up funny, and that would be in particular Breeze. I love Breeze. The crux of this whole thing is that they have to establish a plan how they can overthrow the final empire. Vin, who has been a street urchin her whole life, ends up in a My Fair Lady situation where she ends up having to play a part of a fine noblewoman, and she gets dragged to balls, to court, and she has to schmooze her way in with all of these people in order to gain information that's going to be helpful to Kelsier and his group. And in the meantime, she comes across a nobleman named Elend. This is one of the few times in the story that I do find that Sanderson is lacking. I do think that the way he writes romance is not overly compelling. I think that the two characters themselves separately are fine, but I don't necessarily feel that charisma and attraction to each other on the page. And Elend is not your typical nobleman. The noblemen of Luthadel treat their ska and their servants quite terribly. Most of the noblemen have several mistresses, and once they've slept with a woman, it's the Lord Ruler's command that they have them slaughtered the next day. Elend is not this type of man. He's in fact a bookworm who just goes to these balls and ends up reading for the most part. He sees Vin as kind of an out for having to socialize with all of these people that he doesn't really love, and it ends up that they end up formulating a relationship that will then withstand throughout the rest of the novel. And while it's fine and it works for some people, I don't typically love romance, so for me it's not something that I'm sitting there turning the page going, I can't wait till we get back to the Elend and Vin storyline. I will say the secondary characters in this book are some of the best that I've encountered, particularly Sazed, or Sazed, I believe is how you say it in the audiobook version. So Sazed is something called a terraceman, and he is a keeper, and I thought that the whole concept of this was absolutely brilliant. A keeper is someone that is able to keep knowledge in astronomical ways. They are basically human, or they're not human, but they're terracemen, but they are databases of knowledge. And his specialty is religion, which is really interesting because the way that the Lord Ruler is revered and regarded in this world is very much as a deity, and that's a form of religion for them. So he provides instruction and is the guide to our Vin in this new world that she's embarking upon. The narrative has a lot of twists and turns that are really interesting. He has different species in this series, particularly the Kandra, which are super fascinating. They are able to digest the bones of a deceased person and take on that character and personality to a T, and they are phenomenal actors. he just does a really great job of world building. I don't want to get into the like too crazy spoilers for someone who still plans to read it, but the end, it really picks up at the end. I find that the pacing is good throughout most of the book. I have read that a lot of people found that the pacing of the first book was exponentially better than the second book, and I actually disagree with that. I prefer the second book's pacing. The last 200 pages of this book, I could not put it down. I really wanted to know what was going to come next. One thing I will say is that if I had been reading this when it was first released and I didn't have the second book to immediately jump into, I would have been slightly irritated. So if you are going to read this book, which I highly recommend that you do, I do suggest having the second book available so that you can jump into it right away. All in all, I definitely recommend, if you've been debating, is Sanderson someone that I think I'm gonna like? Is it worth me picking up and reading? Yes, I think that you definitely should. If you are someone that likes world building, likes character development, and learning about different magic systems, then this is definitely going to be something that is incredibly up your alley. It writes rather simplistically, but it is still enough that it is compelling and wants you to keep turning the page. So all in all, I'd give this book probably a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I am excited to continue with the series and then carry on with Sanderson. I know that this year, 2023, is the year of Sanderson. I missed his Kickstarter because I hadn't been reading his books at that point. I'm now kind of bummed that I did, because after reading this book, I definitely feel like he's going to shoot up to the list of my favorite authors. And I'm kind of sad that I'm going to miss out on the experience of getting to be in his pretty much book club that he built through this Kickstarter this year. But the way that I'm compensating for it is that I'm going to go through his books and I'm going to read most of them in 2023. So in my own way, I will have a year of Sanderson all to myself. If you've read this, what did you think? Did you think it was compelling? Is it something that you put down, couldn't put down? Or what's your favorite Sanderson book? Have you given up on him? Are you continuing to read it? Are you looking forward to the year of Sanderson? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to follow me on Instagram, you can find me at Fantasy Awash, and I will see you next time. Bye.